Social Perspectives is brought to you by Everett and Kennings.
Hello and welcome to Social Perspectives. I'm J. Gentile Everett. The Christian community is a vast spiritual family with diverse views on a variety of subjects. Today we would like to focus on the importance of understanding the mercy of God and explore His unique character of love. And I hope we find out God is always open to us and is insistent upon being that presence in our lives that mends our brokenness, massages our pain, understands our plight, and rescues us from our failures. So to enjoy the infinite package of God, eyes must be opened and hearts must be ready to receive Him. So I say to you, my friends, stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. A few weeks ago, a group of ministers spoke with me and they had some questions about ministry and the direction that ministry is currently traveling. They wanted some advice as to what should people really know about preaching, leading people. One of the things that I tried to share with them was, let's be clear about what preaching is and what the preacher is. And I tried to offer some advice in this vein. I tried to share with them to proclaim this gospel using the Greek word kerygma. The demand of the moment dictates that the preacher morphs from man to messenger. It is at that time that the preacher is called to a novelistic space that exists somewhere between time and eternity, somewhere between divinity and humanity, and sort of occupy that chasm between sight and sound. What a place it has to be to experience the linkage of the divine mind to the human imagination. The moment is so special that it is delivered on a stage where the great ventriloquist takes on relatable flesh from the earth's dust. The word that comes forth is metaphorically so lofty that it is delivered on a platform that we commonly call a pulpit. While standing in this space, the preacher must be clear, concise, and cogent about who he is. He needs to be aware that this is what I have to deal with as a human being before I do this message, and that is I have a life of clutter, and it's okay. We have to share that during this moment, it is God who uses ordinary people who have marred and mangled vocal cords. And He will take those marred and mangled vocal cords and insert Himself in it. And He makes the difference in that moment. And when the preaching moment is over, eerily we go back to being that vessel of carnality, one so shackled by a fallen state of existence that even when our intentions are good, sin often fathers our actions. But during that moment, we feel no earthen device. We are not tangled up in our temporal issues. We are detached from them. And we become detached in that moment so that God will be everything, so that people will not even see us. They will only see God. How wonderful it is to be in that preaching moment when chaos dies and we are suspended in a place where eternity and earth intercourses with each other. It's sort of like eternity matriculates into the university of humanity. And it is during that time that chaos dies, when we're in that preaching moment. In that preaching moment, illumination from God is made available to the dark, dim souls that have existed without having the pleasure and the camaraderie of the metaphysical union that exists between God and his creation. I want you to know it is when we hear the gospel that glory becomes imagined and heaven becomes possible. The preaching moment is a special place for all of us who've ever been there. That's not the time for you to focus on your own issues, but recognize that you are in a space where there are a panoply of demons and in every segment of the preaching area. But that does not stop you. The most humbling part of understanding preaching is to recognize that within you there is nothing you have to say. There is nothing from you that's worth mentioning at all. It is the voice of God that will come forth from you. And when you recognize that it is not your own scholarship, it is not your own preaching prowessness, it's not your erudition. Once you understand that everything that I do and everything that I say comes from the divine pulpit of God, and I'm merely a vessel that he's using for this moment. When we get to that point, then and only then can we say to those in the congregation, my friends, there is a word from the Lord. And it is at that point that the preacher dies and the Savior resurrects. And the word from glory enters into the atmosphere of mankind. Stay awake. We'll be right back.
The Renaissance Shoe by JGE was inspired by the rise of Kamala Harris, our Vice President-elect of the United States of America. Get a pair at aliveshoes.com/renaissance-by-JGE-1. Again, that's aliveshoes.com/renaissance. response-by-JGE-1 to get a pair of American history.
Welcome back. I want to speak with you today about a matter of great theological concern. A few days ago, I was on a trip and I was studying the scriptures, going through some of the areas in the Bible that I have always found to be interesting, provocative, and I stumbled across 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19 through 23. It was amazing what I found in terms of theological discovery. So much so until I remember taking a break and pausing and suggesting this is too important for me to just casually read it and let it pass by, because it had to do with Christian behavior. It had to do with Christian motivation, and it had to do with the ways of God. Most of us grew up in cultural atmospheres with respect to religion and God that taught us religion had to follow a certain comportment, a certain type of behavior had to accompany the religion. And if there were a gap, a chasm, or some difference between our apparent character and the character as we understand Christianity to be, that if they were not in every sense agreeable, then there had to be something wrong. Because most of us believe that to serve God, to love God, we have to all have a uniformity in our behavioral patterns. This might be very shocking to many of you. It was to me, quite frankly, because I grew up in a world that taught religion was more legalistic than anything else. We lived by rules, regulations. It was do's and don'ts. I wonder, does that sound familiar to any of you? Very familiar to me. Because we grew up thinking that if you did this, you can't be a Christian. If you do that, you can't be a Christian. So Christianity was more about an outward behavioral presentation more than anything else. So then I had a conflict, and the conflict that I had was, without faith, you cannot please God. Now, I hope you are able to follow this. On the one hand, religion is about behavior. And on the other hand, the text teaches us that you can't please God with behavior. You please God only through faith. Now, many churches, I believe, have this concept sort of confused. Most churches are concerned about their image in the community. They are concerned about what kind of behavior people have in their congregation. This is not a show that's designed to give license to lewd behavior. It's not about that. We're not in any way suggesting that people should not have character and people should not have some sort of decorum about themselves. But what we are suggesting, to please God, one has to have faith first. behavior is secondary to faith. If a person does not have the faith of God, it doesn't much matter what their behavior is or is not. Ultimately, God is going to look at our faith. Now let's try to explore more deeply what Paul is saying here in this part of Corinthians. Paul tells us that I am a free man, but I've chosen to make myself a slave to all people, that I might win them to God. He said, when I'm around the weak, I become weak. When I'm around the Jew, I become a Jew. When I'm around the Greek, I become a Greek. Notice how possibly contradictory that can be, particularly to those who are not quite sure about the relationship they have with God. It can be almost a theological farrago, a mixture of confusion. But here, Paul is trying to get us to understand that I am willing to do whatever is necessary because my motive is what God looks at. Sin, therefore, we're able to see, or what appears to be sin, is not something that is determined by and through the judgments of man. Only God makes that decision. What we should concentrate on, therefore, is doing all that we can to make sure that there is purity in our motives. Our motives must reflect our faith. Our motive is to win people over to God. And if that is our motive, it is as though God is saying, I am not focused on how you present yourself to other people. Even Jesus talked to the religious sect of his day about how you have all of this outwardness that looks wonderful, but your hearts are far away from me. I'm just only hoping that we will understand that Paul is trying to bring to our consciousness that because I'm trying to lead someone to God, and God knows that's what my purposes are, then I do not have to worry about the appraisals or the evaluations of man, because God knows exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm going to suggest to you in this segment as we close, never try to judge the activity of others because we do not see what only God sees. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. We have more. It has been said that power in the wrong hands is a recipe for personal destruction. This has never been more true than in the life of Dominique Washington. Her gains would become her grief. Her unbridled lust and selfishness would be interwoven in her plots. The shocking revelations, jaw-dropping surprises emerged when she realized the lack of a personal core makes one hollow inside. Welcome back. Now, we have just tried to share with you the importance of letting God be God and letting God be the one who does the judging. We're going to give you an example of what we were talking about earlier, about how God looks at the why and man looks at the what. Please make sure you understand that concept. Man can only see the what. It is God who sees the why. Now, that means then everything that looks a certain way as it is presented in the what may not necessarily reflect the purity of the why. Let's give an example. In the Old Testament, in Genesis 38, there is an interesting story there. There's a story about a woman. Name was Tamar, and she was married to a man named According to the Bible, we're told that did what was wicked in the sight of God. And the wickedness to which I refer had to do with had made a commitment that he was going to have a child with his wife, but he would not. The text would teach us that he would spew his seed on the ground to keep from fertilizing her egg. He died. God was not pleased with that action. The father-in-law, whose name was Judah, said to Tamar, have no worry. It's okay. I have another son that I'm going to send to you. The other son married her. The custom was when the older brother died, the younger brother would marry the sister-in-law and raise children in the name of the older brother. Interesting custom, to say the least, but we have to understand we're talking about a time period and a developmental period in our human history that dates many, many, many thousands of years before where we are now. The same thing happened. The second son did the exact same thing. The Lord was not pleased with that either. So then that son, the Lord takes away. Judah, the father-in-law, says to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, just hang on in there. I have one more son that I'm going to send to you. Well, that didn't happen, and it appeared that he may not have even been totally sincere about that. At least he was very recalcitrant. He was slow to action. He was slow to move on that promise, thinking, I only have one son left, and was therefore not all that willing to give him to her. She moved away to a close place, maybe back to her homeland. She moved away, and shortly thereafter, she heard that her father-in-law was coming near that town to handle some business. And she decided that she would array herself and dress herself as a prostitute, because Judah, the father-in-law, had lost his wife, and thinking perhaps he would want to have the pleasure of female company, she disguised herself as a prostitute. Judah, passing by, saw her, and they parlayed together a deal. They both agreed that they would engage in this sexual encounter. let's look at what happened. He wanted the sexual encounter for the benefit of his own lustful satisfaction. She was interested in the sexual encounter to receive the promised son that was supposed to have been given to her through the marriages of his two sons. They both agreed to do the same thing. They both had the same idea in mind in terms of what the actual act would be, but the motives were different. One motive was about lust, and the other motive was about receiving the promised seed from God. When the act was carefully done, and you know the story, and I'm going to shorten the story because of time, she became pregnant. And when she became pregnant, Judah became irate because he was thinking she had engaged in folly. She was still his daughter-in-law. And then when he found out that he was in fact the father of the son she would later have, he wept and he said, she has shown more spiritual love and grace than I have, because of the differences in the motive. God saw the same act, but he looked at it in two different ways. One was a sinful act. That was on the part of Judah. But on the other part, with Tamar, she found favor and had twin sons. And her name winds up in the genealogy of Jesus in St. Matthew. And her two sons are named in that same genealogy in St. Matthew. Isn't that amazing? God did not give her one son. He gave her two sons, twins. And I believe he gave her a son for each husband she had who had committed wicked things in the sight of God to keep her from having her children. Succinctly, I just want to let you know, never judge something by the way it looks, because with God, there may be a why that we know nothing about. I'm going to have to leave it there. And I hope you all will really take time and appreciate the glory and the majesty of God and understand his ways are not our ways.